what is happening now is the West is beginning to allow Ukraine to fire back. I think that adds to the desperation that Russia is facing in this war right now. And so, what is the weapon that is working the very best for Putin in this war? It's his war of words, his war of intimidation.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Gerbeau. And today we are catching up with the former Supreme Allied Commander Europe, General Philip Breedlove. In his 39 years military service, he's held many other positions, including Commander US European Command and Commander US Air Forces in Europe. He's a respected commentator on the war in Ukraine, and we welcome him back to Frontline. General Breedlove, good to see you again. Thank you for your time. Let's talk about Ukraine and that shift in US policy and also that of Germany to grant it permission for limited use of their weapons to strike inside Russia in the defense of Kharkiv. Given the limitations, how significant is it?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. It's always good to have this nice format that you use. I think the starting point of this conversation should be that we need to remember we're in the 10th year of this war. 10th year of this war. It started in that late winter of 13, early winter of 14, and here we are today. And I bring that up because I believe that there's a lot of hullabaloo about how this decision was made quickly and so forth. We're 10 years late in making this decision. We should have never limited Ukraine's use of Western weapons. Russia, since day one, has been using weapons from all around the world to strike from all around the compass into Ukraine. And yet we in the West have limited Ukraine's response. So now let's zoom forward to your real question of today. So we finally, in the United States, made some decisions that some of our other allies, like the UK and others, have already made. And frankly, I think we should have made this decision in this latest war much sooner as well. I'm happy that we have finally done this. I'm happy that we are beginning to allow Ukraine to have effect inside Russia. I'm unhappy that we have done it in such a limited way. It is once again an indication of just how deterred the West and specifically my country is by Mr. Putin's war of words, his propaganda war in trying to affect Western policy. So here we are. We make a decision to let Ukraine use our weapons to fire into Russia, but we limit it to the very shortest range missiles we have. We limit the target set that they can shoot at, and we sort of put boundaries on their ability. It's almost like we're assuring Mr. Putin, listen, we're going to do this to stop your Kharkiv, but we're not going to advantage Ukraine. We're not going to allow Ukraine to defeat you. The basic tenets of this war haven't changed. And I think that's a sad statement on Western policy. And frankly, it's a sad statement on U.S. policy. So we should be allowing Ukraine to use any weapon we give them to attack those forces which are coming to attack them. Russia has had this safe haven just over the border where they can amass logistics and all these things. Now, frankly, Ukraine has been developing weapons of its own to start to bring that under attack, but it doesn't have the depth of magazine. It doesn't have the ability to strike in significant numbers, and that's what Western weapons give them. And we should have made a bigger decision than we made.
And you have long thought and argued that Ukraine should be able to strike inside Russia in self-defense. This, though, is unlikely to change the course of the war. Would you like Ukraine to be able to strike deeper into Russia?
Yes, we haven't given them weapons that can truly strike deep into Russia. Our longest range ATACMS is not what I would call a deep weapon. It is a weapon in the operational level of war, just over the border, but it would bring logistics, troop formations, and motorways and bridges and railroads that they need to bring under fire, it would be a great help. But even the ATACMS is not a deep weapon in the sense that we in the West think of deep attack for maneuver warfare. So I think there's much concern about something that really we should have taken this decision a long time ago.
So, what exactly would you like Ukraine to be able to use in attacking inside Russia? And what would you like Ukraine to be able to attack?
So let's just, I think, all agree that in the provinces all around Ukraine and Russia, the Russian military is using all of those spaces to assemble, train, equip, and prepare attack into Ukraine. I think anything in that operational echelon is fair game. And I think that Russia is doing a pretty good job of attacking what I would call strategic items inside of Ukraine: the infrastructure for energy, the infrastructure for heating, oil, the infrastructure for transportation. Among that, they're also attacking directly, as you know, the population of Ukraine and trying to denude cities and do all this horrendous damage to the people of Ukraine. But I think that Ukraine ought to be able to fire back at those engines of war: energy, transportation, supply, logistics. All of those things should be fair game for Ukraine, as it is when Russia fires into Ukraine.
President Putin's reaction was to tell international journalists he could supply long range weapons to nations so they can strike Western targets. How does this kind of threat compare to the repeated ones we've heard over nuclear weapons?
So, a couple of basic tenets. Mr. Putin's military is failing him to a large degree. Here is a world superpower that has been at war with a neighbor who gave up much of its military capability in agreements like the Budapest Memorandum of 94. And so for 10 years, Russia has been trying to overrun Ukraine, and they haven't done it yet. And so I think there's a certain amount of frustration in what we see and what Russia is doing with its troops. It's throwing manpower away. We hear from very reputable sources from multiple directions. They're losing as many as 1,000 plus a day in Ukraine right now. That is an indication of desperation in my mind. So now, Mr. Putin, one of the advantages he's had in this war is that the West has forbidden Ukraine from firing into Russia, and the West has allowed Russia to fire at will into Ukraine from all around the map on the ground. And so what is happening now is the West is beginning to allow Ukraine to fire back. I think that adds to the desperation that Russia is facing in this war right now. And so, what is the weapon that is working the very best for Putin in this war? It's his war of words, his war of intimidation. We told him 10 years ago what we in the West were afraid of. We're afraid of nuclear, and we're afraid of widening the war. So what has Mr. Putin played back to the West for 10 years, but certainly in the last 2 years? He nearly every week makes some sort of a change or a threat in nuclear business. And nearly every week he mentions that he's going to do something like this, which is give long-range weapons to other people to fire at the West. So Mr. Putin is counting on his best weapon, which is intimidation. We in the West are severely deterred by Mr. Putin's intimidation. He has caused many in the West to take counsel of their fears and make policy based on their fears rather than what needs to be done. And so this, I think, is just one more step. He's desperate. He sees now that Ukraine is going to be able to take the war to Russia on their own soil. And now he's got to find a new step in the intimidation game to get the West to back down, to get Western leaders to take counsels of their fear again and make changes in policy.
And yet, his message is also, you could argue, contradictory, because he also has said, almost in the same breath, that he dismissed the idea that Russia wants war with NATO.
So, so this is a tricky answer because it's going to appear that I'm talking out of both sides of my mouth. I really don't think that Mr. Putin wants a war with NATO. Excuse me. I think he realizes right now his army has done so poorly against Ukraine that it would be absolutely no match on the battlefield for a determined NATO. I think Mr. Putin knows that. But what Mr. Putin wants to do, again, through his intimidation regime, is to snip at and bite at and grab certain things to show to not only his internal audience, but the world that he understands that he has the rest of the world intimidated. And he's going to use that advantage to continue pressing forward. I mean, if you really, having just returned from multiple trips overseas, what is clear to me is that Russia's gray zone war in Georgia is wreaking havoc on the people of Georgia and the government of Georgia. I spent time recently with two of the top three leaders of Moldova. And what Russia is doing in Moldova is bordering on kinetic now, bordering on breaking out of gray zone. So Mr. Putin is incredibly active. Now he's trying to redraw water space in the northern seas. He's recently, we're going to start hearing about it in the news, tried to orchestrate a murder in the United States. And so Mr. Putin is active out there all around the world, and he's counting on this nuclear intimidation to back down Western leaders because it's been very successful so far.
Could you tell me a bit more about what you learnt on your travels then about Russia's grey zone activities?
So I think that I don't want to overcharacterize, and I won't speak for any one nation directly, but having talked to leaders and two of the national leaders of some of these nations, it is clear to me that the Western nations are beginning, and that includes some of the larger Western nations, are beginning to tire of these incessant, freewheeling Russian operations in their countries. We're starting to recognize what they are doing in our cyberspaces, what they're doing with money, moving money around, what they're doing orchestrating deaths in foreign nations. This is beginning to now raise the ire of leaders to the point of taking some sort of action. And how that will play out, maybe that will be a conversation at the Washington summit coming up soon.
What kind of action are you talking about that's being considered?
I can't speak for NATO. I can't speak for those people anymore. I would tell you that there are folks in these nations that are going to start taking more concrete action. People are starting to talk about seizing, using Russian money and taking those actions where they can make the pain increase for Mr. Putin.
Interesting about what you're talking about, the awareness of grey zone activity, and something that did hit the news recently is Russia having been condemned by EU leaders for this provocative behaviour after border guards removed around 20 buoys along the Narva River used to demarcate the Estonian-Russian border, being seen as part of this broader pattern of hybrid actions by Russia on its maritime and land borders in the Baltic region. I mean, is that how you see it? And what do you think Russia is trying to do with it?
Well, I think this is exactly what Russia's trying to say. First of all, Mr. Putin is having a bigger problem internally. He has to show some progress. He has to show some success. He has to show that he's standing up to the West. He has to continue to lie to and convince his people that the West is trying to attack Russia, and that the United States is the great engine of the West in trying to attack Russia. And so these nibblings, like I said before, these little nibblings around the edges, the sea spaces in the north, the border with Narva, all of these things are ways that Putin is trying to show his people that he is strong, he's standing up to the West, and the West is the great enemy. And I think that we in the West have decisions to make. If we allow Mr. Putin to do these things in the northern seas, redraw the lines, pull up the water buoys, he allows these things to happen. If we allow these things to happen on the border, then Mr. Putin will continue to push. I was reminded by one of the national leaders on this trip. He told me the story that Lenin apparently said that when you face your enemy, you fix your bayonet and you push your bayonet into his belly. And if his belly is soft, you keep pushing. If the belly is hard, then you pull back and reconsider your options. And so Mr. Putin is pushing his bayonet into our belly, all around the edges of NATO. And he will continue to push where we're soft, and he will stop pushing where he meets hard resistance. The question is, are we ready? Are our leaders ready to make the tough decisions to present a hard belly rather than a soft belly?
And in that particular instance, on the border area, the water border area between Russia and Estonia, I mean, the response really so far has been kind of, come and explain yourself, Russia. I mean, it's not exactly what you'd expect if to show a sort of a tough stance on that. What do you think the correct response should be?
Well, I learned very quickly as the SACUR, I couldn't tell any one nation what to do. Estonia will make some decisions on its own, and that's a great country, and they get it. But again, Russia's going to push until they hit something hard. And so when are we going to take those steps to tell Mr. Putin no more? I understand up there when they moved the buoys, one of the fishermen wandered east of where Russia thought was their waters, and they seized his boat and they still have it and so forth. So this is beginning to be a little more serious than just moving buoys around. And so I think that the West, again, have some decisions to make. Today, um, as a part of the D-Day celebration, I was asked to make comment on Eisenhower's decision and how hard that decision was and how consequential that decision was, and that if it went right, thousands would die. If it went right, thousands would die. If it went wrong, tens of thousands would die, and our history would be very different. And then SACUR number one, SACUR Eisenhower, soon later to be President Eisenhower, he made a tough decision, and knowing that thousands were going to die if it went right. My question to the commentator today was, do we have Western leaders today that understand what the price of freedom is, what the price of democracy is? And do we have leaders that are willing to make decisions that we know will cost us, but are required to preserve those freedoms and democracies that we believe in? And I think that question is open. Do we really have that kind of leadership in the West today?
I'm going to ask you another question later on about your reflections on this anniversary, the 80th anniversary of D-Day. But just to return to actions by Ukraine, or reports that in late May, the Ukrainian drones were used to attack Russia's nuclear early warning system in Krasnodar, shutting down radar, and that a third in Orsk near the Russian-Kazakh border failed. What do you think of this departure?
So I haven't spoken to the Ukrainians about that attack. I would love to. My guess is that the Ukrainians believe by making that attack, it would make it easier for them to attack with ATACMS, and it would, in their mind, make it harder for Russia to characterize Western response. I don't know. That's what I guess. I don't think that Ukraine would attack that just to provoke Russia. There are those, and some that I really respect, who believe that blinding a Russian intermediate or strategic level sensor is not good. I understand that approach. But again, if the Ukrainians believe that this is a radar that is hurting their war effort and is needed to characterize Ukrainian response to Russia, and that's why they took it out, I could also understand that. So I refuse to take judgment until I hear why they did it.
So it's unclear right now if this is some part of a new campaign of targeting Russia's nuclear infrastructure.
I think that's unclear. I really don't think that that would be the goal of Ukraine. I think that trying to affect their operational level fight is much more likely. But once again, I have not talked to them, and I really don't want to be a part of starting rumors either way.
Fair enough. The US, and we've spoken about it being reactive, not proactive in its support for Ukraine. But that kind of incident, though, is going to play to President Biden's cautious approach, isn't it?
Yes, it will. We in America, I won't speak now to the West, but I can tell you we in America are deterred. We are overly cautious about taking steps that would, quote unquote, provoke Russia. I don't know how much more provoked Russia has to be. You look at this inhumane, illegal, crazy war that Russia is pursuing. How much more do we have to provoke them? The damage that they're doing inside of Ukraine is incredible. And so I think that we're way overly cautious. But I'm not the president of the United States. The president of the United States is apparently very, very, very concerned about provoking Mr. Putin, and so he's making decisions of very limited nature for fear of provoking Mr. Putin. And I think that we're going to have to at some point put forward that hard belly that stops the probing of the bayonet.
President Zelensky gave an interview to the Guardian newspaper recently, and he expressed this kind of frustration, the lack of urgency in supplying Ukraine. And he said it's easy and fast to re-equip the brigades, and it's the speed that the West constantly lacks, says that Russia is faster than the West. When you're at war, he says you have different priorities. And he says that perhaps the problem is that the West is at the luxury of feeling safe. And I'm just wondering if that is true, is it perhaps a fault that we're not yet properly feeling the grey zone attacks that Russia is carrying out that you've described? Is it important that we're made more aware of exactly what's going on that isn't the sort of kinetic, the fighting aspect of war?
So let me answer your question in a different way. And if it doesn't satisfy, come back at me. But here's the way I see it. The West right now truly believes that they can keep this war limited to Ukraine. And I heard something that is extremely critical, but I'm going to repeat it because I sort of agree with it. And that is that right now, it's pretty apparent that the West is willing to sacrifice Ukrainian soldiers, and the West is willing to sacrifice Ukrainian civilians, men and women, children, and that the West is willing to sacrifice Ukrainian land for Western safety. Do you get my point? The West is willing to let this war go on in Ukraine because they don't want it to spill over into the West. And I think that sooner or later, that is going to fail. What we clearly see is Mr. Putin is already emboldened in all of the gray spaces. And now he's starting to get emboldened in some of the not so gray spaces and some of the kinetic things, moving buoys, changing maps, putting people on borders. And so and I don't include me, but I would say our goal in the West of containing this in Ukraine, and trying to appease Russia again in Ukraine by giving them land in Ukraine, I think in the end is going to fail, because Russia, remember, this all started in 2008. Our response to Georgia was inadequate to task. We rewarded bad behavior by giving them 20% of Georgia. 2014, our Western response was inadequate to task, and we gave them about 13% of the most important commercial spaces in Ukraine. And now here we are in 2024, and we're once again trying to find a method of appeasement to give Russia more land for peace. And it won't work, just like it didn't work in 08. It didn't work in 14. It's not going to work in 24. And so if we reward bad behavior, we reward bad behavior, and we reward bad behavior, and then we expect to get good behavior to follow that, shame on us. People who believe like that never raise children or grandchildren.
Yeah, I mean, having said that, there does seem to be a slight contradiction in the sense that when President Biden just said recently that he doesn't believe in the NATOization of Ukraine, and he explained why that peace doesn't mean NATO, but he also said in the same breath that he recognizes the need to stop Ukraine falling to Russia, because he said Poland and other bordering nations would go down too, would be next. So he does seem to understand that the danger of it spilling far beyond Ukraine.
Yeah, this is a contradiction in his discussion. It clearly is. I think the first part of that conversation is Mr. Biden talking to Mr. Putin. He's trying to assure Mr. Putin that, we're not going to advantage Ukraine to the point where they could defeat Russia, because I do not believe leaders in the West at this point are academically prepared to deal with a defeated Russia. Russia has convinced senior leaders in the West that a Russian loss would mean all these catastrophic things, and the Western leaders have accepted that as a truth, and they're trying to find a way out of this war. And I would tell you there is no way forward that capitulation improves the situation in the world. Capitulation will just mean further invasions. 08, 14, 24, 28, 32, 36. As long as we allow Mr. Putin to get away with bad behavior by intimidating us, he's going to keep doing it. Why would he change?
Yeah, and the intimidation, I mean, it never stops, does it? Because since this report has gone out that France may be sending, or may already have sent, military trainers to Ukraine, Sergei Shoigu has threatened that they would be legitimate targets inside Ukraine. Now, I presume, am I right in thinking that in itself would not trigger an Article 5 response from NATO in defence, one for all, basically? Is there any circumstance you can see under which an Article 5 could be triggered inside Ukraine itself?
I think that an Article 4 could be triggered, and a consultation could happen, but NATO will have to make a decision about whether something that happened to a NATO troop inside of Ukraine is Article 5 or not.
So what is not? Can you just explain an Article 4, sorry, and how that might happen?
There are three articles that people talk about, but two of them they rarely talk about. The first one is Article 3. So let's start there. Article 3, in Phil Breedlove words, says that defense begins at home. More precise terms, it says that you should invest in your own defense to be able to defend your country, and then create excess capacities to support the allies in the alliance. Article 3, defense begins at home. Article 4 is that article that says any nation at any point could bring to the NAC an issue and say, this just happened, and we need to consider this in terms of further action, possibly Article 5. So Article 4 is often called a call to consultation. Any nation can call for an Article 4. And then Article 5, of course, is when nations begin to respond as an alliance to an attack. Let's remember that in history, the alliance has not responded to some things, but groups of nations of the alliance did respond. After the first attacks into Crimea, nations came to the SACEUR and said, we need you to respond. And the SACEUR, took options to the NAC, which the NAC chose not to take. That's their prerogative. So later, then, when NATO was attacked, or excuse me, when Russia attacked into the Donbass, those same nations came back to the SACEUR, me again, and said, okay, what are we going to do? Once again, options were taken to the NAC, and the NAC chose not to accept those options. So what happened in that case is I, as the U.S. European commander, in consultation with the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense, chose to take U.S. unilateral actions in support of the Baltic nations and others. And the minute we did that, other nations started piling on. The UK and others came immediately to join the coalition. And then days after that, NATO changed its entire air policing status to join what the US started doing in a unilateral sense. So we have Article 3, defend yourself. Article 4, a nation thinks it has been offended and brings to the NAC for consultation. Article 5, response. In between Article 4 and Article 5, there can also be coalitions of the willing of NATO partners that respond.
When you talk about those moments where you were asked to show more support and it was requested, had you been allowed to do what it was requested, what do you think today's situation would look like?
Okay, now I'm just offering you my opinion. This is dangerous ground, but we offered a scale of options, and you heard them discussed in the press. Things like capping over. Remember when Ukraine was calling for close the skies, close the skies. We offered caps. We offered many different options for trying to preclude the war before it started. And for the reasons that we all understand, the NAC chose not to take any of those options. Their number one reason was, this is too provocative. It will cause the war to start. Well, we took no action and the war started. So we will never know whether, if we had taken some action to get NATO cap or some other form of support in there, we will never know if the war would have been precluded. But what we certainly know is, because we took no action, the war started. Again, Mr. Putin saw a soft belly and he pushed the bayonet in because there was no resistance.
And just finally, General, you commentated, you were saying you were involved in broadcasting on the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings in Normandy to liberate Nazi-occupied Europe. President Zelensky has written about this on X, and he said this event and day serve as a reminder of the courage and determination demonstrated in the pursuit of freedom and democracy. Allies defended Europe's freedom then, and Ukrainians do so now. And President Biden has also said he's compared the fight for Ukraine to the fight for freedom, which began on D-Day. It's a sobering moment, isn't it? What should we take from it?
Well, I'm going to sound a little bit like a broken record, but at D-Day, we had strategic leaders who took strategic decisions that they knew were of consequence. Again, we knew that if it went right, thousands would die. We knew that if it went wrong, it could go horribly wrong. And our leaders had the courage to step forward. We are not to the point yet where Western leaders have really stepped forward on Ukraine. As you and I just discussed a minute ago, I believe many Western leaders are wanting to keep this fight bundled up in Ukraine. And again, a very critical commentary was that we're willing to sacrifice Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians, and Ukrainian land to keep this bottled up in Ukraine and not let it spill out. That's not the decision that was taken on D-Day. The decision that was taken on D-Day is this landing force, and it was bigger than America, you remember. We had allies on beaches all along, and those nations went ashore knowing it was going to be ugly, and they went ashore anyway to make a difference. We haven't come to that point in Ukraine yet. The world has not chosen to make a difference in Ukraine. The world is still making decisions, hoping to keep this bottled up in Ukraine. Keep it there so that the rest of us can be safe. That was not the kind of decisions and leadership we had at D-Day in World War II. We went all in, and we went in there and did what we had to do, knowing, again, that even if we won, it was going to be ugly. But we were willing to pay that price for freedom and democracy. We have not made that decision yet in Ukraine. We have not made that decision yet in Ukraine.
General Philip Breedlove, good to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Good to speak to you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio. My thanks to Louis Sykes, our producer. To support the work of Frontline, hit the subscribe button. You can also listen to Times Radio throughout the day or read it at times.co.uk. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.